As you can see from the title of this video, today I'm going to talk about existence and why I think that it is objectively valuable, or in other words, objectively good. But before we even get into any of the argumentation that I want to do, it is very important to understand our definitions here. So, to me, objectively good is that which ought to happen. So typically, and today and always, I use this sort of formal definition of moral goodness or value because I think it's the closest thing we can get to a good objective definition that is not biased and not subjective. So the best way to describe a morally good thing would be to say that for whatever reasons we might give, it just is preferable to other things instead of itself. So something is morally good if it ought to be the way that it is, and it is morally bad if it ought not to be the way that it is. So now I would like to propose an argument that is broken into two sections and which supports the conclusion that existence itself, or in other words, the world, is an objectively good/valuable thing. If you saw the discussion I had with Kane Baker, then you're already familiar with the premises, although unfortunately it was very difficult to discuss this with him because we have some very foundational differences in our philosophies. So I think it's better if I present it here and I provide a defense of these premises. So let's begin with the argument. The first section of the argument goes as follows. Premise 1. All contingent facts require an explanation. Premise 2. All definite objects are contingent facts. Premise 3. The set of all contingent facts cannot be sufficiently explained by another contingent fact. Conclusion. The set of all contingent facts cannot be sufficiently explained by a definite object. Now, of course, if you are familiar with this, then you will immediately recognize that this sort of argument is very similar to the contingency argument for the existence of God, although, of course, I'm not using it to prove the existence of God in this particular context. But let's look at the premises. The first one, that all contingent facts require an explanation, is simply the principle of sufficient reason. And I know that today it is quite common to see philosophers trying to say that the principle of sufficient reason is perhaps not that good or problematic, or we shouldn't actually accept it completely because it leads to absurd conclusions. But if I'm being totally honest here, I think the principle of sufficient reason is the principle upon which the entire philosophical game is based on. If you don't think that contingent facts require an explanation, then you reject the very idea that we should philosophize and reach conclusions about the world. You see, philosophy is about gaining knowledge, it's about trying to learn things and understand the external world. So the problem here is to say that we need to understand the external world just is to say that contingent facts require an explanation. If they don't require an explanation, then there is nothing to be learned in the first place. There are no explanations to be sought after, and so there is no point in doing philosophy or science or whatever. We would simply say, you know what, I put my hands up in the air and it's like, nope, everything just is, and there is no explanation about any contingent fact. So, again, we cannot say that contingent facts do not require an explanation, in my opinion, because then we completely reject the very concept of philosophy, and we're simply having a different discussion than the one that we're having right now. So I think the first premise is generally uncontroversial. The second premise needs a bit more explaining. All definite objects are contingent facts. Personally, I think this is a matter of definition, because what is it to be a definite object? Well, to be a definite object is to have particular traits, is to be a particular thing and not a general thing. You're something particular. So, for example, to be a piece of paper is to have a certain structure, a very particular structure of particles that end up having this paperish feel or whatever, and to have a certain shape and a certain dimensionality, a certain weight, all of that stuff. And as Wittgenstein had said, if two objects truly share every single trait that makes them definite, then you're no longer talking about two objects. There is no such thing as A equals B. A is A, and if B truly equals A, then B just is A. And so it's quite important to ask, what is it that makes definite objects have traits? Well, to me, what makes most sense is some idea of hylomorphism. So basically, every object has a certain substance and a certain form. And we might say that in a modern understanding of the world, every object has the same substance because every kind of physical object is made out of the same kind of matter if you divide it down far enough. So everything shares some kind of material substance. And what really makes the difference between different objects is the form that they have. And let me give you a pretty famous example of this. Imagine you have a cat in front of you, right? And you also have this device, let's say it's a box, a mechanical box, where whatever you put into it, every piece of matter will stay within it. So no matter what happens inside the box, no amount of matter will escape it. Let's just imagine that this is possible, okay? Well, if you put a cat into that kind of box, and then you squash the top part of the box to the down part of the box, and you just obliterate the cat into many pieces, and there's this bloody mess inside, and you basically destroy the cat. But you know that the matter that made up the cat is still inside that box, because no amount of matter escapes the box. Well, the question is, if the exact same kind of matter that made up the cat before is still there, why is there no cat there? And the answer is, what made up the cat is really the form of the substance. So it had a certain structure, and this structure made up the cat, and what you did by squashing it is just change the structure. You basically destroyed, quote unquote, the structure or the form that made up the cat. So this is just a very simple example of why I think hylomorphism is very plausible in describing what objects actually are in the world. And even if you don't think that metaphysically it is the case, we can at least agree that analogously this is true. So what makes an object is the way in which its matter is constituted. Now let's shift our focus to the idea of contingency. Why is it that I think that the definiteness of objects just necessitate the very thing that we call contingency? Well, to say that something is contingent is basically to say that it is particular enough that it requires explanation. That's why we say that things are contingent upon other things. So, for example, the blueness of an object is contingent upon the physical constitution of the object. It is also contingent upon the physical constitution of light and the light that goes on it and comes off it. So it is contingent upon other things. And the reason we understand that it is contingent upon other things is because it is particular. It is because it is definite. If it were not particular, then there wouldn't be anything else to be contingent upon it. There wouldn't be any reason for it to be contingent upon other things. The fact that paper can be burned is a contingent fact. It is a fact that is contingent upon the constitution of paper. And the constitution of paper is such that under certain conditions it becomes burned. So again, we all recognize, just based on the principle of sufficient reason, that to say that paper burns just for no reason and with no explanation would be completely irrational, because particular phenomena require explanations. So the very fact that definite objects are definite is the reason why they are always contingent facts. The very definiteness itself tells us that they are contingent upon other things. And somebody might raise the objection that, well, definite objects might be contingent, but what about objects that don't have definition? What about indefinite objects? To that I would say that to say that an object lacks definition is just to say that there is no object at all. Because having definiteness is the same thing as having traits. If I say that this thing that I am pointing to right here has some traits, or has at least one trait, I am giving it a definition. I'm telling you what it is that makes it this object instead of something else. So to say that something is not definite, i.e. doesn't have traits, just is to say that there is no thing at all. The only thing that lacks all traits is nothingness. So there is no such thing as an indefinite object. To be an object just is to be definite. And as we said, having a particular physical definition is the thing that necessitates your contingency. It is the thing that tells us that you're contingent upon something else. And I would seriously just urge anyone who's listening to this to think of a single possible object that is definite and has particular physical form that doesn't require an explanation. If you can think even of one thing, I will give up this entire idea. But as of now, I think it is just an impossibility. Now, moving to the third premise, I think this is purely logical. It's like, if you have the set of all contingent facts, then you cannot be sufficiently explained by another contingent fact, because that contingent fact would be within the set of all contingent facts. So the only claim that is being made here is that the set of all contingent facts cannot explain itself, and that's because everything within that set is contingent. So if everything about a whole is contingent upon something else, then how could the whole itself possibly be necessary? It seems like a very implausible idea. Also, if the necessity doesn't come from something within the contingent set, which we have just established, and at the same time we claim that the set is necessary, then that would mean that the set would have to be infinite. So there would have to be an infinite regress of contingent facts that are constantly explaining each other. But this does not provide a sufficient explanation for the set. For example, think about a cliff. Let's say there is a cliff somewhere and a person is hanging from the cliff but doesn't fall down. And now that person has underneath him another person who is also hanging from him. And underneath that person there is another person that's hanging from him, and underneath that person there is another person that's hanging from him, and so on and so on. If the entire set of persons does not fall down, this just means that there has to be someone who is standing on the ground above. If nobody is standing on the ground holding all the other chain of people, then it just doesn't make sense why the set doesn't fall down. So to say that there is an infinite number of people going upwards with each of them hanging on to each other, it just doesn't make sense. Since they don't fall, it is merely a rational observation to say that there has to be a person who is standing on the ground, even if the number of people that are hanging are infinite. And we understand that by the fact that they don't fall down. And the same analogy can apply to the physical world and to all contingent facts. The set of all contingent facts cannot explain itself. No matter how many relations you posit, even if they are infinite, there has to be an external, necessary explanation for the set itself to make sense. Now let's summarize this first section of my argument. So, first, all contingent facts require an explanation. This is simply the principle of sufficient reason, which is the most basic principle that one needs in order to do any kind of philosophy or any kind of science. Second, all definite objects are contingent facts. This follows from the fact that the very definiteness of objects, the very form of an object, means that it is differentiable from other things, and so it requires us to seek an explanation as to why it is particularly this particular thing instead of being anything else. Third, the set of all contingent facts cannot be sufficiently explained by another contingent fact. This just follows logically if we understand causation in the first place. And so the conclusion that the set of all contingent facts cannot be sufficiently explained by a definite object simply follows from deduction. Now, the second section of this argument is admittedly a lot more controversial and needs a lot more explaining. So, it is simply one premise and one conclusion. So, premise 1. Only a value cause can fully and untrivially explain the set of all contingent facts. Conclusion: existence has a value cause. Now, what the hell does all of that stuff mean? Well, to give a complete explanation, we have to understand something about Aristotle, because this is a very Aristotelian type of argument. Now, in modern science and philosophy, typically when people talk about causation, we understand it in the language of efficient causes. So, basically, what is it that caused your thought to appear? Well, it was some kind of movement in your brain activity, some kind of electrical signal or whatever. What is it that caused that? Well, something about synapses and different neurons. What is it that caused that? Well, it's some kind of other efficient cause, some kind of physical thing that literally caused that to be the case. So if we think about something like a building, if we were to explain how that building was built by explaining it with efficient causes, we would say something along the lines of, well, this particle moved this way, this particle moved this way, this particle moved this way, infinitely, almost infinitely, until we were able to explain every single little movement that happened and evidently caused the building to be there. Now, this basically answers the question of how is it that the building came to be. It simply tells us to show what mechanism, what kind of happening led to the other happening, which led to the other happening. But for Aristotle, causation is a way broader idea, and I think today it would translate better as explanation. So, for Aristotle, there is something called the efficient cause, which is what we just described, but there is also something different. There is the material cause, the formal cause, and the final cause. The material cause explains the matter, so it explains the kind of substance that the thing is made of, that the building is made of. That would be just, the material, it would be the particles that make up the building. The formal cause is the explanation of the structure, so what kind of structure, what kind of shape does this thing have? This would be the formal cause. Although, again, the word cause here is used very, very, very broadly. I think it's better to conceptualize it as explanation instead of cause. But the final cause is the most interesting one here. And basically what it means is the final product. This may seem kind of contradictory because you would think that the thing that causes the final product to be what it is isn't the final product itself. But ask yourself this question. Why is it that the builders got all of that material and put it into a different structure and built it upon itself, etc.? Why is it that the builders did all that? Well, the reason or the explanation for why they did all that is the final product, or at least the idea or the purpose of the final product. So the final explanation, the final cause, is basically the purpose for which the formal, the material, and the efficient cause happen. And in a very real way, the final product is the thing that caused it to be the way that it is. Not in a causal chain manner. That's why I specified that the word cause here is very broad. Not in a causal kind of way, but in an explanatory way. The final product itself explains itself because it is the purpose for which all of the other causes happen. It is the explanation of the why. Now, I'm not here to defend or explain exactly what Aristotle meant by all this terminology and stuff. I'm not Aristotle. I'm a different person. So what I want to do is extract the useful ideas from what Aristotle said to explain a contemporary issue. So here's the thing. When we explain causal events, when we explain what happens in the world, we tend not to use this final cause or teleological sort of language because it seems that the world doesn't have a mind and the world doesn't intentionally do stuff in order to achieve goals the way humans do with the building. But it's very curious to think, what kind of explanation gives us a resolution to the contingency problem? What kind of thing, what kind of cause would make us content with the idea that there are contingent things? Most people posit a necessary being or a necessary cause, but what they have in mind is something like an efficient cause, something that just sort of brutally causes the world to be. That's why they call it like a brute fact, right? It's this thing that causes the world to be, and that's all that there is to say. My issue here, and that's why I have written it in the premise as well, is that this just seems so trivial. Like, it doesn't give me a real explanation, or at least it doesn't give me a whole explanation as to why contingent things happen exactly the way that they do. It doesn't fully explain the particularism of the physical facts of the world. It seeks to give an explanation in terms of like what caused the world to be, but it doesn't really explain why it is this particular kind of world, why this definite collection of objects instead of any other definite collection of objects. And so it seems to me that this idea of a final cause could come in very handy here. Not in a strictly speaking teleological manner, although you could label it as teleological, but in a manner of saying there is a real ought. You know, there is a truly necessary existing ought, whatever that means. And this is why the world has this particularism. And this kind of explanation actually does provide the explanatory power of not being trivial and truly giving a whole explanation. Because, again, our problem with contingent facts is the very fact that they are contingent. It is that they are particular, definite, and they could have been anything else. Like, they have these traits, and yet we seem to need to explain why these traits are the way that they are. And so this idea that, just like the builder has the purpose of creating this final product, and so the final product or the tendency towards the final product in some ways caused itself, we could use this kind of reasoning to give a different kind of holistic explanation for existence itself. In other words, when we ask, why is it that there is this contingent set of facts, we can say there is this contingent set of facts because this contingent set is somehow valuable, or because it ought to be so. The very reason why there is all of that particularism and all of this whole chain of contingent things that cause each other to be is that it ought to be this way. It is preferable, it is objectively good that it were to happen this way. And before you say that this is all like wishful thinking or anthropocentric thinking, first of all, I am not saying that some mind wanted this to be this way, although I think this is perfectly possible. I mean, the simulation theory is quite a good theory, and even certain deistic theories are pretty plausible in my opinion. But this is not necessary. This could be just a kind of tendency. We could just posit that there is this natural, necessary tendency towards this particular kind of contingency. And before you say that there is no empirical data to support this, or there is no fact in the world that tells us that this is the case, I think if you truly sit down and comprehend how absurd it is for things to exist, if you do a sort of Heidegger route towards this, you will see that it just begs some kind of explanation. At some point you would see this and you would say, this just seems so arbitrary and so trivial without something like a final cause, without something like a value cause. And this is exactly what contingency points to. The reason why contingency seems so problematic is because it forces us to confront the fact that there are definite and particular things, and this fact alone is completely absurd because we know that every definite and particular thing is caused and explained by another definite and particular thing. So it just begs the question, when you look at all of this stuff, of why is there all of this stuff? And when you eliminate physical causes as explanations, you're just left in a place where you cannot find any kind of efficient cause for existence, and yet there seems to be this need to find a cause. And what I am proposing is that instead of a typical cause, we could explain this phenomenon through an explanation of value, through an explanation of natural tendency, natural preference. And this kind of stipulation becomes even more substantiated if we accept the idea that there are functions in the world. I mean, you could make the case that there are no functions, but I think most people would intuitively disagree with that. Because it seems that the universe has a certain structure, it has physical laws, it has certain kinds of substances, certain kinds of particles that behave in particular ways, and the fact of the matter is that it ends up producing things that are very complex and very weird, like consciousness. I mean, you have a world, and not only is there this absurdity of there is a world, and then you have the further absurdity of, well, you have a world which produces stuff like subjective experience and produces stuff like self-replicating and self-protecting stuff, which becomes, living things. and now you have to explain that through contingent efficient causes. And at some point you look at it and you say, well, this whole thing doesn't make sense without a different kind of cause. And even if it does, even if in fact there is no such thing as a value cause that explains existence, at least I can make the case that this explanation is one plausible answer. And if we look at it and we compare this plausible answer to other plausible answers, we see that it has some strengths and some weaknesses. So a naturalist would say, well, your theory is not parsimonious. You are positing a new entity that you have not verified. In other words, you are positing this natural tendency, this existing ought, which explains the world. And I would say, okay, yes, it is less parsimonious than the purely naturalistic explanation, but it has a lot more explanatory power. And this is where the theory is strong, because I believe a value cause gives a lot more explanatory power as it pertains to explaining existence than any other kind of cause that I can think of. It not only provides a solution to the problem of contingency by explaining why the contingent set of facts is this particular contingent set of facts, but it also gives answer to the possible absurdity, and I say possible because some people may deny it, the possible absurdity of the fact that there is functional stuff in the world. So it gives a full and holistic explanation to two different epistemic problems by positing one entity. So as of this point in my life, I find that this explanation is good. I find that it is a solid explanation based on a pretty plausible philosophical framework, and that's why I prefer it to other explanations. So I would honestly love to hear some feedback on this, because it is a very fresh thought in my head, and I am afraid that I might be missing something without realizing it. So if you guys are interested in this, or you find some objections to it, I would be happy to hear your criticisms. And thank you for watching this video.